Okay, so we're getting ready to move on to the Gothic era. There are three phases of the Gothic era: early, high, and late. Um, you will need to know the difference between the early, high, and late um, stylistic features. So in early Gothic, we get early Gothic's years are from about 1140 to 1194. Middle or High Gothic is from 1194 to 1300, and Late Gothic is 1300 to about 1500. The Gothic style really begins and ends in different places at different times. So, Gothic in, say, England is different than Gothic in Germany. And its peak and late times have different exact eras. This is something that we started with in the beginning of class. This is something we're going to end with at the end of class, and that is that what era something belongs to is based on what style it's in and the stylistic hallmarks that make it belong to that era, and not necessarily the date. So, Giorgio Vasari, who was the very first art historian, considered the father of art history, dubs the Gothic Gothic. He said Gothic was to say that the art was done by people who were inferior and destroyed the Roman Empire. People who had classical ideas were considered more sophisticated and more important. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Gothic style was the avant-garde in Europe. So Vasari's basically using this term Gothic to put down the architecture. It's used to say that it's not as superior as the architecture of classical antiquity. We see the Gothic first appear in France in the second half of the 12th century, and by the 13th century, the style has spread completely through Western Europe. But in the eastern and southern parts of the empire, the Byzantine and Islamic styles still prevail. Here's a map of Gothic Europe. I'm sorry, it's a little dark. Getting maps for this class has been kind of a challenge. So this is one I took with my phone out of the book. So I apologize, it's not quite as bright as I'd like it to be. But what I want you to see is that the southern part of Spain is ruled by the Umayyad caliphs. The Umayyad Empire is the empire that prevails during the Gothic time. They've taken over all of Northern Europe and most of the Middle East. During the Gothic time, there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of change. 1337 sees a 100 Years' War that shattered peace between England and France. The 14th century sees the Black Death that kills at least 25% of Western Europe's population. We see the Great Schism, which is a political and religious crisis that happens between 1378 and 1417. And there's a shift in society. For a while now, the monasteries and the countrysides have been the epicenters of trade, well, the epicenters of innovation. But pilgrimage churches are rapidly expanding, and so secular cities have a lot more people in the city area. And so the new great cathedrals are being built because of the urban development. With that, there are prosperous merchants that have homes. Universities who are run by professional guilds of scholars are formed, and independent secular nations of modern Europe begin to take shape, starting with France. Here's that map again. Just take a note of where France is and where its relationship to Germany and the Roman Empire is. At some point, we're going to see this interesting alignment that happens between the Roman Empire and the European countries. Their main issue right now is the uh, Islamic caliphs trying to take control. So let's talk about the Gothic style in France. Um, France is the birthplace of the Gothic style, and the person who is responsible for putting the ball in motion is Abbot Suger. Abbot Suger creates a church that has a sense of royalty. He uses rib vaults and pointed arches. He opens the space and makes it larger, and he starts with this new concept called Lux Nova. So, in the last side, you heard me mention guilds, and I need to sort of explain to you what a guild is. A guild is an ancient union of people that band together to help make their businesses more profitable. They were very prominent in the late medieval, early Renaissance times. They were powerful entities that had important political and socio-economical impact. They had important influence in the socio and economical impact locally, but they also had important socio-economical impact as a nation. The best example I can give you is maybe a town is known specifically for the bread that they produce. It would be because there are several powerful people that work together to create a bread capital. In the United States, I would say Wisconsin's famous for cheese, right? It's a product that they naturally have, that they naturally produce, but it takes a lot of businesses that are working together to produce that world famous cheese. So like you've got the people who own the dairies, the people that own the cows, the people that own the land. They all have to work together to create magnificent cheese. It's not that much different in the medieval world. In the medieval times, though, the feudal system dictated that the entire town produced what the town needed, that incoming goods were done sparingly, and that the town mostly was self-sustaining. So for now, that's a good explanation of the guild. We're going to see how guilds become more and more powerful as time goes on. So let's get back to French Gothic architecture. Abbot Suger is the head honcho here when it comes to French Gothic. He is the right-hand man of King Louis VI and King Louis VII. During the Second Crusade, he was a regent of France and rebuilt France's royal church in Saint Denis. Saint Denis was a Carolingian basilica in France's royal church. It was a symbol of the monarchy, and it housed Saint Denis' tomb and the tombs of the French kings. So if you've ever been to Europe, you will know that the church actually has many people buried inside of it. That started with the Romanesque tradition of the pilgrimage, in which people would go from church to church looking for blessings and paying homage to the relics. That tradition was carried further to have major monarchs buried within the church. Sometimes the church will have a crypt underneath it, but also bodies of important members were often memorialized in the apses of the church. So Abbot Suger begins to rebuild Saint Denis in 1135. He redesigns the facade and the sculptural portals the doors. And from 1140 to 1144, he works on adding a new choir, ambulatory, and radiating chapels. Hallmarks of the French Gothic style at Saint Denis are rib vaults that appear on top of the pointed arch. A rib vault is basically exactly what you see here. They take that pointed arch that we've talked about, the groin vault, and add a spine to it where it intersects, and it gives it this skeletal looking system. They were often designed to cover the ambulatory and chapels, and the vaults enabled builders to eliminate walls. They opened up spaces and added stained glass windows to the walls. Abbot Suger called the colored light that came through the stained glass lux nova, which meant new light. This concept of lux nova became very important in the Gothic era, and I would say is important today in a church as well. The church that you experience at 8 a.m. is going to be a different experience at 5 o'clock at night. We went to Arizona 2 years ago, and we decided that we wanted to watch the sunset. We were in Sedona, Arizona. And the chapel that we were in was built at the top of the mountainside. And so you could sit in the chapel and watch the sunset. And that experience was so incredible because you got to watch the colors change, or you got to watch the colors of the walls change as the sun went down. And as the light shined through the stained glass onto the floor. It was a unique experience, as I would imagine the light in the morning time when the sun rises is a very unique experience as well. And so the light that comes in through the stained glass windows is meant to help the viewer feel transported into the heavenly realm. It's meant to help the viewer have a stronger connection with the divine. So Saint Denis was a key monument of early Gothic sculpture. It was an important work of art because it establishes some hallmarks that are then carried through to the new Gothic church styles. Suger's sculpture for the west side of the abbey did not survive the French Revolution, so I can't show you a picture of it. But by the mid-12th century, the structure was completely intact. He also has plans for a few things that don't follow through. The new facade, he had plans for a double spire in the front. It only has one spire because the church, he passed away before the church could be completely finished, and they never completed the second spire. The double tower was something new design-wise. Originally, the church had these massive thick walls that were left over from the Romanesque time period. And so he was trying to sort of open the wall up. Why? Well, he wants to emphasize the windows. So big, thick walls and windows don't really go together. So he wants to make the walls thinner, make the walls taller. The church has to be able to house the new amount of traffic that it's seeing from the city. There are a lot more people in the urban development areas. The rose glass window was added, which becomes a standard in French Gothic architecture. And the 3-portal doorway becomes standard as well. The three-portal doorway has sculptures of the Old Testament kings and queens and prophets attached in the columns, and we're going to take a close look at those here in a minute. This is the floor plan of the church at Saint Denis. You can see the ambulatory as well as the radiating chapels. You can see that the radiating chapels are numerous. This broken spider-like line is indication of the rib vaults that we just looked at. Here's a close-up of the front facade of the Church of Saint Denis. You can see better how only one spire was completed and the second one was sort of half done. Abbot Suger was on a committee with Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and 5 other archbishops. We talked about Queen Eleanor in the Romanesque time. They developed a whole new east end of the church. In the original basilica, the original basilica was built by the Carolingians, and it was too small to house the growing number of pilgrims that were coming from the Crusades, but also from the pilgrimage sites. And so it was the official church for France, and he builds a completely new facade. You can see the ornamental exterior, the piercing of the walls for the bells and the bell towers. That's what the spires are in the front. And of course, you can see the 3 front portal doors, even though you don't get a nice close-up of them. You can still see that they exist. So the things that end up being hallmarks of French Gothic culture are the double spire in the front, the rose stained glass window in the front, and the 3-portal doorway in the front. In the beginning, in the early Gothic, we see large cathedrals like the cathedral at Chartres. Building histories of urban churches often extended over decades and sometimes over centuries, and that's because funding runs out. Fire is a real problem for the churches, either from incoming groups who are trying to take over, or just because fires seem to naturally be a cause of destruction in the medieval times. For example, Chartres' construction starts in 1134 during the early Gothic period, but it was destroyed by fire in 1194 and it had to be reconstructed. When they reconstruct it, they update the style, and that updating of the style is always done in the current avant-garde styles. So when it burnt down, or when it was built in the early Gothic, but by the time they rebuilt it, it was high Gothic time. So you're going to find that some churches have what feels like a hybrid of styles. Chartres would be a prime example of that. Right now you're looking at an early Gothic church. As we get to the high Gothic, you'll see the high Gothic elements added to it. So in the early Gothic, we often have these portal doors. The portal doors usually contain sculptures on the right and left of the door. Those are referred to as jamb sculptures. The tympanum still bears decoration, and then the area around the tympanum is called the voussoir. It is a projecting sculptural relief that comes to build up the door. Here you can see the center panel has a mandorla with Christ in the center, and looks like the 4 evangelists all around him. This is the Leon Cathedral. It has typical Gothic features. It has a huge central rose window, 3 voussoirs, or 3 portal doors. and a deep penetration of the walls in the top mass. So you can see in the spires that are in the front facade that you have these deep cuts into the facade. That's a bell tower there. And the deep cut allows the sound of the bell to be rung and heard throughout the local area. The Leon Cathedral seems to have a hallmark that some cathedrals have, in that, or some of the Gothic cathedrals have, which is this deep cutting of the front of the facade. So the slits that allow the noise for the bell tower to come out seem to be a major part of the architecture's design. In addition to, in the facade, you see this deep inset of the rose window, primarily because the building seems to rise above the rose window to sort of filter the light in. And then the voussoirs from the portal doors extend greatly into the viewer's space. This deep cutting of the facade, as well as the deep inset of the rose glass window, is it brings about a visual sense of reduction of the mass of the wall in front of you. So the wall seems lighter and less heavy, which was a goal of the Gothic. The people in the Gothic era believed that the lighter the building seemed, the taller the building seemed, the closer or the better chance they had of their prayers ascending into heaven. Here you can see the interior of the Leon Cathedral. It is a 4-part nave elevation with a single side aisle. You can see that the so you've got the first lower level slide aisle. Then you've got another arcade above it in which people stood and listened and worshipped. The third level is called a triforium. It is a false level. There's no way for anybody to stand there, but it gives the illusion of the walls being taller. And then above the triforium, you see the clerestory. The clerestory is a pointed arch window that goes up into the ceiling. It is called a lancet when the window goes up into the ceiling. This is Notre Dame. So there was rapid urbanization, and King Louis VI decides that he needs a new cathedral to accommodate the people of Paris. There was an unknown architect that wanted to add windows with transforming light, and so they invent the flying buttress. Up until now, buildings had support systems that were large and blocky. The walls were thick and heavy. So what happens when you want to add a window to a wall? You're taking out some of the wall's mass in order to put a glass panel in. The glass panel needs support, as well as the wall needs support, because you're taking away part of the material of the wall. And so they invent this thing called the flying buttress. It's this attachment to the building that attaches at the top of the building where the windows are, and then juts out and attaches to the ground. It gives the building a sort of exoskeleton-like quality. It feels somewhat spider-like, like a daddy longlegs. And it emphasizes the elongation of the tall wall. The repeated round circular windows are called oculi. And you can see how adding the stained glass all the way around makes the building feel lighter and airier, a big departure from the Romanesque thick walls. Notre Dame sort of bridges the gap between early and high Gothic. In 1130, Louis VI moves the official residence of Paris, the official residence of the king to Paris, which causes more commercial activity and with it a building boom. And so the cathedral, Notre Dame, was built along the Seine River to house that growing number of people in Paris. It replaced a large Merovingian church that was originally there. It has a 4-part nave elevation and a triforium with the glass oculi. Here is the back exterior of Notre Dame, where you can see that flying buttress really, really well. The flying buttress is sort of the element of definition for the high Gothic or middle Gothic time. It's the quintessential hallmark of a Gothic building. Two of the 4 stories in the elevation of the building are completely done in glass. And you can see the spectacular rose window here in the front of the cathedral. Here's an aerial view of Chartres. So we looked at Chartres, then we looked at a couple other cathedrals, and now we're going back to Chartres. Remember how I said a lot of times these churches would have fires? That's what happened. Chartres had a fire, and so in its rebuilding, they rebuilt it in the High Gothic style. Now, those of you who have, most of you, I'm sure, remember Notre Dame catching on fire a few years ago. I think that Notre Dame had a fire before then, but it's the only fire that's been there for hundreds of years. And that was the danger of these type of churches. The roofs were made of stone, but the actual roof support structure was made of wood. So what you're looking at when you're inside the cathedral is a ceiling of stone, but above it are the wooden timbers that help the church have such a high elevation in the ceiling. And so because of that, they're susceptible to fire. Okay, so we're looking at Chartres Cathedral again. Just like I had explained before many times, they would have a fire, and when the building was rebuilt, it was rebuilt in an updated form. And so Chartres now moves from being an early Gothic cathedral to a high Gothic cathedral. You can see that they have extended the rectangular bays to include more space. They include more space to help support an alternative support system with the flying buttresses. They now had a 4-part elevation. Well, I'm sorry. They kept the 4-part nave elevation. You can still see the triforium and the lancets in the clerestory. But the extension of the rectangular bays allows them to put more relics in the rectangular bay, as well as store or house more crypts. Some architectural art historians believe that Chartres is really the very first High Gothic cathedral. Um, it's both. It's an early Gothic and a High Gothic cathedral. But I think one of the things that is so important in terms of the new features of Chartres has to do with the jam figures. Those are the statues on the portal doors. We looked at them at the cathedral at Chartres when it was built in the early Gothic, but they've replaced them now with more natural looking figures. You get a greater sense of individualization in the face and in the clothing. The clothing is draped across the body in a more realistic way. And instead of looking like part of the door jamb, they now look like an individual sculpture that rests on a platform on the jamb. The architectural setting really doesn't determine the pose. The saint appears to be communicating with one another because they turn slightly towards each other and away from the viewer. This turning slightly towards each other and away from the viewer is called a sacred conversation. They're having a conversation that you are not part of, that is only between sacred figures. The figure at the left is Theodore, and he's an ideal Christian knight. He is a late Gothic sculpture, and we'll see more of those. But for now, know that in High Gothic, the sculptural jamb figures change from being part of the door to an actual sculpture that stands on a pedestal and has more individualization. It's less elongated and tends to feel more natural than what we've been seeing. The stained glass is updated at the cathedral, and it helps to bring in reflective light. There are two types of stone window frames that the glass is set in. This is the Our Lady of the Beautiful Window. It is a tall lancet. It survived the fire of 1194, and it's a central section depicting the Virgin Mary enthroned with Christ, the Christ child, in her lap. It's original from 1170 and is set against a blue background. There were Gothic and Byzantine builders that were used. The Gothic and the Byzantine eras use light to transform the worshipper's experience. This is a rose window that was gifted to Chartres Cathedral by Queen Blanche of Castile. The stained glass here has a new technology. It is so very large. It is 43 feet in diameter. Think about how big 43 feet really is. It's almost 6 feet wide. Oh, I'm sorry. 43 feet. It's the length of about 7 people. It is stained glass window technology, and it's heavy on blue and red. The light was once again to transform the worshipper's experience, primarily focused on the worshipper's experience for people who can't read. The rondel in the center of the picture has the Virgin Mary, and around her are 4 doves and 8 angels. The square panel contains images of the Old Testament kings. And the lancet changes in hue, as does the picture with the motion of the sun. All right, so we are in full High Gothic at Amiens Cathedral in France. It was begun in 1220, and we know the architects Robert de Lazarches and Renaud de Carmont. They began construction in 1220, and the nave was completed in 1234. The radiating chapels were completed in 1247, and the choir in 1270. It uses complete High Gothic structural vocabulary, meaning it's got a 4-part nave elevation with buttressing system. It has rectangular bays with rib vaulting. It has a self-sustaining skeletal structure in which the walls feel as if they hang on to that skeletal structure. That's that flying buttress that becomes very important as the windows open up to include lots of light and lots of stained glass. Here is a shot of the ceiling. Remember, the nave is 144 feet tall with a 3-part elevation. You can see how tall the clerestory is that goes into the ceiling in those lancets. You can see the triforium as well as the additional worship levels. Amiens Cathedral is the Gothic counterpart to Hagia Sophia. No expense was spared. All stops were pulled out to make an incredibly beautiful cathedral. Here is the front exterior of Amiens. You can see that the portal doors have really become much more ornate. The voussoir juts out from the portal door and goes up high above the first row in the nave or in the facade. You can see that the front has this feeling of deep cutting into the front of the facade in the bell towers. This is that double spire that France so much adores, with the very large stained glass rose window. Right below the stained glass rose window is a new technology or a new stylistic feature that is called the King's Gallery. It's a row of sculpture right underneath that rose window that is sculptures of the Old Testament kings. The portals in Amiens Cathedral are very similar to the Lyon Cathedral, and the upper part is more complex because it has deeper piercing in the walls and towers. The sculpture extends to the areas above the portals, and the band of statues below the rose window is called the King's Gallery, like I just told you. The towers were added in the 14th and 15th century. At Amiens Cathedral, we also see new jam figures, new portal figures that are a lot more naturalistic. You see a figure standing on a ledge. It has now been completely disconnected from the doorway and is its own independent sculpture. It even has an overhang at the top of the head so that the naturalism of the human doesn't get wet in the elements. Additionally, Jesus holds his hand up with the 2 fingers upright. That's the signal of the benediction or a blessing. And instead of having this serious look that drives fear into sinners, he has a more approachable look to him. These are the Annunciation and Visitation sculptures from the Reims Cathedral. Once again, another example of those portal sculptures that are much more realistic in the latter part of the Gothic period. You can see that they're having a sacred conversation, meaning Elizabeth and Mary are speaking to each other and not acknowledging the viewer. You can see that this sculpture completely is detached from the portal door and just feels like a sculpture. This is the Church of Sainte-Chapelle. It is a very tall church. Instead of having that four-part nave elevation, the top of the church actually is 100% made of stained glass windows. The skeletal structure supports the stained glass windows, and in this case, it feels like the walls hang on the skeletal type structure. There's a special term for this style. It's called the Rayonnaud style, which is a combination of stained glass and pronounced skeletal system. It has a heavy focus on the red and blue coloring and gold leafing in the ceiling. Here you can see a little bit better. The ceiling is painted in blue with little gold stars. It was built by King Louis IX, who was a royal patron of the Parisian courtly style. The Rayonnaud style is a style that is preferred by the courts. King Louis inherits the throne at age 12. His mother, who was Blanche of Castile, served as France's regent until he reached adulthood, which was very common. The regent advised the young king about matters of importance in which they felt the king wasn't old enough to rule on his own yet. Queen Blanche of Castile was declared a saint after her death, and united the best qualities in a person. Well, I'm sorry, I am misreading that. Queen Blanche of Castile served as regent to France until King Louis IX reaches adulthood. He was declared a saint after he died, and united the best qualities of a person. He was a Christian knight. He lost his life in service to the church. He was a benevolent monarch and a holy man. He became a model of medieval Christian kingship during his reign. The art of architecture of France was admired and imitated throughout Europe. Okay, so look at your book on the Church of Sainte-Chapelle. I don't feel like I've communicated really well to you the different stylistic features of the Rayonnaud style. So use your book as a supplement here. This is the court style of King Louis IX. You can see that the sculptural image of the person has become very naturalistic. The body imitates an S curve, which if I were in the classroom, I would be able to show you exactly where that S curve is. It's basically a way in which they depict the body to seem as if it has more lifelike qualities. It's a stance. It's the exaggerated sway of Mary's body as her hip kicks out to support the baby Jesus. This is the High Gothic Cathedral, the Reims Cathedral. We describe this church as if God sort of stuck his hand out of the sky and stretched it. If a church could be Stretch Armstrong, it would be the Reims Cathedral. There's a featured King's Gallery above the stained glass rose window. The opening in the towers make the towers feel as if they're actually not walls, but made of sort of these linear spines over top of the rose window. It's very striking. The tympanum over the doorway has now been replaced with a stained glass rose window, and the voussoir jets up above the doorway into the area of the rose window. Here you can see the jam sculptures. I'm sorry, we looked at this slide a few moments ago and I told you it was from a different church. These are the jam sculptures of the Rheims Cathedral. This is the Visitation of Saint Elizabeth visiting visiting Mary during the Annunciation that she is with child. You can see that the support system to the columns is not as pronounced, and the sculpture tends to look a lot more humanistic and realistic in terms of a person. Mary is being honored as the Queen of Heaven, and you can see that Mary has a lot of individuality, and so does Elizabeth. You know that Elizabeth is older than Mary, and you can see Mary in that S curve that we talked about just a moment ago. All right, we are finally at the late Gothic. This is a church done in the late Gothic style from St. Maclou, France. It was begun in 1500, and so this is an important point. By 1500, Michelangelo was creating art in Italy, meaning that in Italy they were going through the Renaissance. But in France, because they're part of Northern Europe, they were still hanging on to that late Gothic style. This late Gothic style is called flamboyant. It is called flamboyant because it looks like a flame. The front portals extend above the rose glass window, and they reach so tall that it feels very flame-like.